Hi, this is Remembering the Past, a show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with Katherine Johnson, who died recently at the age of 101. She was one of a group of African American women who had advanced computational skills and worked for NASA in the 1960s when there were very few women and very few African Americans, but it was her computational skills that led them to calculate and to check their figures that allowed the astronauts to fly in the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. From The Guardian on Katherine Johnson. Katherine Johnson overcame racial and gender-based discrimination to become an integral part of NASA's work in space exploration. One of the trailblazing African-American mathematicians whose story was told in the hit film Hidden Figures died, NASA announced on Monday. She was 101. In a statement, the U.S. Space Agency said, "Today we celebrate her 101 years of life and honor her legacy of excellence that broke down racial and social barriers." Johnson worked on complex missions, including Alan Shepard's history-making journey into space, and provided the final calculations needed for John Glenn's mission into orbit. Her lightning speed led colleagues to call her a human computer. Our NASA family is sad to learn the news that Katherine Johnson passed away this morning at 101, the NASA administrator Jim Bridenstine said in a tweet. She was an American hero, and her pioneering legacy will never be forgotten. She was born in August 1918 in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. With fellow mathematicians Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, and Dr. Christine Darden, her story of overcoming racial and gender-based discrimination to become an integral part of NASA's work in space exploration was largely overlooked until the release of Theodore Melfi's Oscar-nominated film in 2017. On screen, Johnson was portrayed by Taraji P. Henson. Among tributes on Monday, the science writer Maryam Zaringalam posted a quote by Johnson: "Girls are capable of doing everything men are capable of doing. Sometimes they have more imagination than men." In 2015, Barack Obama awarded Johnson the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In November 2019, she was selected to receive the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor presented by Congress to a civilian. Darden, 77, is now the only living hidden figure. Here's Taraji P. Henson as Katherine Johnson with Kevin Costner in Hidden Figures.
Where the hell have you been? Everywhere I look, you're not where I need you to be. It's not my imagination. Now, where the hell do you go every day?
To the bathroom, sir.
To the bathroom. To the damn bathroom. For 40 minutes a day? What are you doing there?
We're T-minus 0 here. I put a lot of faith in you.
There's no bathroom for me here.
What do you mean there's no bathroom for you here?
There is no bathroom. There are no colored bathrooms in this building or any building outside the West Campus, which is half a mile away. Did you know that? I have to walk to Timbuktu just to relieve myself. And I can't use one of the handy bikes. Picture that, Mr. Harrison. My uniform, skirt below my knees, my heels, and a simple string of pearls. Well, I don't own pearls. Lord knows you don't pay colors enough to afford pearls. And I work like a dog, day and night, living off of coffee from a pot none of you want to touch. So, excuse me if I have to go to the restroom a few times a day.
Well, we're going to move on to another person with a great computational brain, Larry Tesler, who died recently at the age of 74. Tesler was a nice Jewish boy from the Bronx High School of Science. He moved out to Stanford. He got involved in Xerox in the late 1960s, early 1970s. In 1973, he was at the Palo Alto Research Center, which we talked about before. He pitched a bunch of ideas out there that they couldn't see the commercial value from, but a guy named Steve Jobs could see the commercial value, and he took them from Xerox, sort of like what happened with Gary Starkweather, whose podcast we've done a couple of months back. Most importantly, Larry Tesler invented the cut and paste command, which everybody uses every day, and he was also involved in a lot of the early prototypes of Apple equipment that's still in use today. Here's the BBC on Larry Tesler. Larry Tesler, an icon of early computing, has died at the age of 74. Mr. Tesler started working in Silicon Valley in the early 1960s at a time when computers were inaccessible to the vast majority of people. It was thanks to his innovations, which included the cut, copy, and paste commands, that the personal computer became simple to learn and use. Xerox, where Mr. Tesler spent part of his career, paid tribute to him. The inventor of cut, copy, and paste, find and replace, and more was former Xerox researcher Larry Tesler, the company tweeted. Your workday is easier thanks to his revolutionary ideas. Mr. Tesler was born in the Bronx, New York, 1945, and studied at Stanford University in California. After graduating, he specialized in user interface design, that is, making computer systems more user-friendly. He worked for a number of major tech firms during his long career. He started at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, before Steve Jobs poached him for Apple, where he spent 17 years and rose to chief scientist. After leaving Apple, he set up an education startup and worked for brief periods at Amazon and Yahoo. In 2012, he told the BBC of Silicon Valley, "There's almost a rite of passage. After you've made some money, you don't just retire, you spend your time funding other companies. There's a very strong element of excitement of being able to share what you've learned with the next generation." Possibly Mr. Tesler's most famous innovation, the cut and paste command, was reportedly based on the old method of editing in which people would physically cut portions of printed text and glue them elsewhere. The command was incorporated in Apple software on the Lisa computer in 1983 and the original Macintosh that was released the following year. One of Mr. Tesler's firmest beliefs was that computer systems should stop using modes, which were common in software design at the time. Modes allowed users to switch between functions on software and apps, but make computers both time-consuming and complicated. So strong was this belief that Mr. Tesler's website was called nomodes.com. His Twitter handle was @nomodes, and even his car's registration plate was nomodes. Silicon Valley's Computer History Museum said Mr. Tesler combined computer science training with a counterculture vision that computers should be for everyone. Sid and I have talked about how guys like Larry Tesler never worked at NASA. It would have been interesting to see what would have happened with the two cultures, the buttoned-down military culture of NASA and the loose, free California culture of Silicon Valley. Here is Larry Tesler in 1985 talking about the future of computing.
Well, I think our next guest can help us do that. Larry Tesler has joined us now. Larry worked at Xerox PARC. Larry helped develop the Lisa, and he's now the manager of the Future Architecture Group for the Macintosh. Larry, you and others at Xerox PARC in the early 70s had a vision about what we're going to see in the 80s, and you hit, looks to me, right on. What were the steps that led us to this kind of a user interface that we're dealing with right now?
Well, there was a lot that went into it. It really probably started back in the 60s with Doug Engelbart's NLS group at SRI in Menlo Park, where they envisioned the coming of office automation and developed a system where actually the first mouse was used. It was a mouse very much like this with 3 buttons. But they were way ahead of their time, 20 years ahead of their time. Anyway, at Xerox PARC, a few people from that group came and joined us. And the main motivation at PARC was an understanding that hardware costs were plummeting. And systems with high-resolution graphics, which were then would cost $100,000 for a reasonable computer-aided design system, would be coming down in price to the point where someone could have it in their living room or in their office. This was really incredible at the time. We could barely believe the numbers, but there they were.
The time was when, Larry?
This was 1970 is when PARC started. I became an employee in 73.
There are visions of things like the Dynabook, for example, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
That was almost a reality now.
That's right. So we could see very much this sort of thing. And so we had this vision of workstations that had high-resolution bitmap graphics and mice, and networks tying them together, and laser printers, and file servers, and just what you see beginning to happen. People thought it would be coming around 1980, to about the point we are now. So we were a little optimistic, I think, by about 5 years.
Well, what is the relationship between the work that was done at Xerox and the work that took off, say, in Apple with the Lisa and the Macintosh? How did that work out?
Well, what happened was that our research group at PARC was developing a system called Smalltalk, which was actually intended for educational users. I also spent part of my time working with a group that was developing systems for business users, so I got involved in both projects. Around 1980, it became pretty clear that Xerox was going to focus their attention entirely on a certain segment of the marketplace with fairly high-end workstations, like the Star. And my personal interest was in personal computing, and there were a few others at Xerox with a similar interest. So several of us all moved to Apple and brought with us this inspiration to pursue the Smalltalk work, which was well known in the academic community, but it wasn't really being taken advantage of by any manufacturers.
That's interesting now that Apple is trying to move into that office automation area. What about the future? Where is this thing going? What kind of things? You had a good vision, say, 10 years ago. What's going to happen in the next 10 years as far as this?
Well, I think there'll be some improvements still in visual presentation and pointing devices, but I think the main change we'll be seeing is in the area of communications. The ability for information in corporate databases to be downloaded into personal computers and actually usefully processed. The ability for people to prepare routine work to have it done for them by their machine. To have what we call an agent in the machine, which represents you in transactions with other individuals.
We're going to move on now to Diana Serra Cary, who died recently at the age of 101. She was Baby Peggy, one of the last surviving child stars of silent films. She was so big in the early 1920s that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had her on a platform with him, waving a flag at the 1924 Democratic Convention. Here's the Washington Post on Diana Serra Cary. During her brief career as a silent film star, Baby Peggy came perilously close to death time and again. The child actor, a toddler when she debuted in 1921, was thrown from a speeding pickup truck, narrowly escaped a horse trampling, and survived near drownings and incineration, all in the pursuit of making movies in an era with minimal supervision of child welfare. Born Peggy Jean Montgomery, she became one of the country's youngest self-made millionaires by age 4, then suffered a devastating reversal of fortune and fame in her adolescence. In adulthood, she rebounded with a new name, Diana Serra Cary, and became a respected author of books on Hollywood film history. In her autumnal years at screenings of her few extant films, she found herself embraced as a movie pioneer. Mrs. Cary was born into the movies on October 29, 1918 in San Diego. Her father, a former cowboy and park ranger, worked as a stunt double for Western star Tom Mix while her mother was a movie extra. Baby Peggy was 19 months old when her mother brought her to Century Studio, where a director paired her with the animal star Brownie the Wonder Dog. She made dozens of shorts over the next several years, many of which have been lost. Those that survive show a precocious toddler with a gift for physical comedy and mimicry. A still from the short Peg of the Movies in 1923 shows her in a slinky dress and holding a cigarette in an imitation of exotic actress Pola Negri. In other comedies, she parodied film stars Rudolph Valentino and Mary Pickford. Doing her own stunt work, she was held underwater in seashore shapes in 1921 and positioned under the rods of a train in Miles of Smiles in 1923. By 1923, she was signed to a bigger studio, Universal, where she commanded $10,000 a week for feature-length films. The next year, she starred opposite Clara Bow in the comedy Helen's Babies. To be taken seriously, studio chief Carl Laemmle said, "A child star should make you cry." To that end, he cast Baby Peggy in The Darling of New York, a 1923 tearjerker with treacherous stunt work about an immigrant family that survives a tenement fire. For the film's climax, the set was doused with kerosene and set ablaze, including by accident a door that was to serve as Baby Peggy's escape route. She improvised by breaking the window and clawing her way out across a burning windowsill. The scene is all that remains of the film today. Baby Peggy lent her name and images to sweaters, jewelry, handbags, and dolls. In 1923, her father secured her a $1.5 million contract with independent producer Saul Lesser. For Lesser, she had her last starring role in Captain January in 1924, the story of an elderly lighthouse keeper who adopts an orphan girl and nearly loses her when she is reunited with her aunt. The film was later remade as a vehicle for Depression-era Muppet star Shirley Temple. When her father bickered with Lesser over her salary, the movie mogul reportedly blackballed the family. For the next 4 years, Baby Peggy and her parents worked in vaudeville, then in its waning days before the rise of sound films. We had a house in Beverly Hills before I was 3, then we had a house in Laurel Canyon. Then we had a Duesenberg car that was $30,000. I was making a lot of money. My films were circulated all over the globe and I had piles of fan mail, but they thought Hollywood was forever. My parents had no plans for adulthood for my sister and myself. We weren't sent to school. We simply grew up and worked. We had no education at all. I did have the good luck to have one tutor. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius at Depths. We're going to close with a brief mention of Jeannette Du Bois, who died recently at the age of 74. Good actress. She was Walona on Good Times, the CBS spin-off of All in the Family and Maude.
Hi, I'm Walona.
But she's best known for writing and performing the theme song to the Jeffersons, another spin-off. And as a final tribute to her, we'll end with her singing that theme song, Moving On Up.
Well, we're moving on now.